Welcome to our video. I'm Alfred.
And I'm Azan Marwah.
Today, we talk about death. Let's start with a conversation with some very sad subject. Two people, they live together as husband and husband or wife and wife, and one of them got sick. The first question that I come across very often is, can I look after my same-sex spouse? And the answer sometimes can be a little bit controversial. Mm-hmm. Of course, if we're talking about at home, you're giving him tea, you're cooking him meal, you're taking him to the bath, nobody is going to intervene. But in the hospital, do they have visitation right? Do they have some decision-making process? And in that respect, it seems to me that the answer is not definite.
No, and my first question would be, are we talking about a government hospital or are we talking about a private hospital? Because if we're talking about a government hospital, the government hospital has the same obligation that you and I have talked about now many times to not discriminate between people on the grounds of their sexual orientation. So that means that a government hospital cannot deviate in their service because a person is gay or lesbian. They have to treat you the same. So that will include treating your spouse as though they are your spouse, the way that they would have treated a heterosexual couple. So for visitation, making arrangements in the hospital, the government hospital are under an obligation to treat you the same.
But obviously, the concern a lot of people have is when there's disagreement among family members over whether the patient should receive a certain treatment, medical treatment. And in that respect, do you think that there would be any conflict or disadvantage if the spouse is the same-sex spouse?
Well, there is the obvious disadvantage of sometimes you encounter prejudice. That's a general issue. And sometimes merely being in a same-sex relationship can cause conflicts. That is a reality. So it benefits couples to have prearrangements in place so that those decisions, that the other spouse is empowered to make those decisions. But in terms of the legal framework, it's pretty arguable, and I would say strongly arguable now, that in terms of applying for things like mental health orders, guardianship boards, guardianship orders, that a same-sex couple will likely be in the same position as an opposite-sex couple.
But as a practitioner, what I see most of the time in problem is when the patient himself or herself cannot speak anymore. And the family members, including the spouse and the other family members, have disagreement over who to visit, who to look after her, or especially who to look after the financial affairs. In this respect, the only way to make sure that the patient's will is heard is have it properly documented.
In advance.
Yes, advance, yes.
Yeah.
We talk about Advance Health Directives, enduring power of attorney. Enduring power of attorney is particularly important because in the absence of enduring power of attorney, if one person becomes incapacitated, they cannot make a decision themselves, who is going to look after the financial affairs of this person, especially if he or she is the breadwinner? The family relying on the financial resources to continue providing for the family or to look after the medical bills. And in that respect, actually, it's a very practical question. Who is going to pay for the mortgage, right? I have to say, the committee application is actually quite complicated. Well, it's just applying to the court, but in order to prepare for the application, you need to put down in details what are the family to be involved, what are the assets to be involved, and whether all the family will be involved before the court, making the process of determining who to look after the financial affairs and the committee order being appointed.
And this kind of application is an all cards on the table application.
Yeah.
And you can put yourself in a very difficult position if you were not complete and thorough upfront.
Yeah. Not to mention that it's a very costly application. An application like this will be hundreds of thousands of dollars. Compared with the EPOA that we're talking about like tens of thousands of dollars, it's actually very cost effective to have an enduring power of attorney in place. Unfortunately, in Hong Kong, there's no lasting power of attorney in place. What would be the difference?
Well, in terms of whether or not there's a lasting power of attorney or
Advance Health Directives.
Well, honestly, Alfred, you tell me.
Okay. Lasting power of attorney authorizes someone to empower you to make a decision for you. Advanced Health Directives only restricted to whether the person want to receive a particular medical treatment in the event of a life-threatening situation. This is a big difference because how to govern all this? When is the life-threatening situation? And there are decisions that the person may want to make without going down to that level of life-threatening. For example, whether they want to be resuscitated or whether they want to receive intrusive medical procedures like operation. A lot of people don't want to suffer. And actually, I think that this is the predominant tone of most people. They appreciate the quality of life, and they do not want to suffer without having the actual benefit of really sustaining the life.
But haven't you had the experience that people are reluctant to talk about these things unless they're, in a sense, already living through an aspect of that suffering?
Absolutely. Most people don't want to talk about death. Most people won't want to talk about pre-death or post-death arrangement. And that is the reason why there are a lot of situations when we haven't even come across fighting over the dead body. In that respect, who has the right over the dead body?
This is a fascinating question. Most people don't know, but you can't actually own a dead body.
Wow.
Yeah, it is not a piece of property. It's not something that you can claim that you have some ownership of.
Yeah.
Even afterwards, you probably know that a lot of people keep ashes of their loved ones. That is not a piece of property. It's not something that you can own. But instead, you can have the legal right to make decisions about what happens to that. That's not quite the same thing as ownership. Now, in Hong Kong, typically the people who can apply for those things to be released, let's say after a death has been declared and a coroner has announced the cause of death, the body might be released from the government, or it might be released, whether it's for burial or for another disposal like cremation. Really, you have to go and apply for that.
Okay.
Now, until a couple of years ago, it was up in the air. Well, what happens if you're in a same-sex marriage, a same-sex relationship? Some people die in Hong Kong without any family except their same-sex partner. Now, in some ways, those cases are easier, and it's a bit harder when there's a competing person, someone else turning up and saying, "I'm his brother," or "I'm her sister," or "I'm her father," or "I'm her mother," and saying that they would prefer to get that. Now, there's a hierarchy, a priority. Spouse is at the top.
Yeah.
Now, until 2 years ago, it was very uncertain who it was. Until very sadly and unfortunately, one of my clients died, and his spouse came forward and said that he wanted to go through all the after-death arrangements. Now, when that happened, very unfortunately, the government staff who dealt with it said that they weren't going to recognize the relationship, weren't going to allow him to identify the body, weren't going to allow him to make the application before the coroner, weren't going to release the body to him. Now, it was only after he filed a case in the High Court that the government said that that official was wrong. That is not government policy, and the government accept that when dealing with after-death arrangements, a same-sex spouse is in the same position as an opposite-sex spouse.
Thanks to him, that same-sex partner's recognition in that respect is now confirmed.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they would be dealing with the grief of losing the very beloved one, and at the same time dealing with all this trouble.
It is an overwhelming trauma to just in that worst moment of your life, dealing with the death of your spouse, to have someone say they're not going to empower you and they're not going to recognize you. They're going to treat you as though you have nothing to do with that person. And I give a lot of credit to Henry Lee, who pushed forward that case to say this shouldn't happen to anyone else ever again.
Absolutely. But he's our hero.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Actually, we have the personal contact with him, knowing the pain that he suffers.
Yeah.
Every time that I think about it, I always remind ourselves the importance of planning. And that actually can be achieved with a will. A will confer the spouse, if he is appointed as an executor, that can deal with all this.
Yes, it can empower them. It can effectively give permission and give an indication about what should happen to the body or who should be making the decisions.
But then, funnily enough, making the will or the availability of it was the government reason to object same-sex spouses from inheritance.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, this is actually kind of incredible that basically the government says, you can make a will so that the inheritance intestacy ordinance doesn't have to cover the same-sex spouse. Fortunately, that was rejected.
That's right. So many people may not know that there is a very complex regime that deals with what happens if you die without a will in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And there are a series of, very well, there are a series of priorities about who gets what.
Yes.
And it's fair to say that the top class priority is your spouse.
Yeah. In terms of intestacy rules, usually the spouse will get the 500,000 and half if they have children. In the absence of any children, the spouse will get first 1 million and then half, with the rest to be shared with the parents of the deceased, or if they predeceased, the brothers of the deceased. But actually that is a very controversial subject because a lot of people thought that the spouse
gets everything.
Which is not
true.
the case.
Yeah.
And in particular, when there is an argument over domicile, which actually in Hong Kong as an international city, too many people came from other countries, they come here to work, they may consider Hong Kong as their permanent home, or they may not. Even if they don't, they may not want to return to their original countries and they want to go somewhere else.
Alfred, I would go further and say that a lot of people, they assume that certain things will happen to their property when they die. And I would take the very classic example of what happens to your apartment.
Yes.
Some people buy apartments in the name of their parents or in a tenancy in common or a joint tenancy with their parents or third parties. Then they get married and they assume that their share of the apartment will automatically go to their spouse.
Yeah.
But sometimes that's not true.
Yes, especially when nowadays Hong Kong, with the stamp duty policy, is actually discourage couples from joint owning a property because they always want to buy one property and then buy another one and rent it out for rental income as a part of a long-term financial planning. And when things go south, be it as death or divorce, they would have argument over who pay what, who should get what, and these become very messy, especially in terms of the inheritance. If it is, for example, one person owning the property and that person passed away, with the intestacy rules, thanks to Henry again, that same-sex partners are recognized, he will get 1 million plus half of the property, but the other half will be co-owning with the other family members. What if they cannot agree over when to sell the property? He may not want to sell the property because he has always been living there, and he may have already been paying for the mortgage most of the time.
What if, and I'll ask a question.
Yeah?
What if you own a property in a joint tenancy with your let's say your mother,
Yeah.
and then you get married,
Yeah.
and then you die.
Oh,
Who gets the property?
the mother, because it doesn't
In
form
total.
part of the estate. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And really, what I would strongly advise anyone in a same-sex relationship, as soon as you get married, take advice.
Yes.
For estate planning. That's the time to do it, because what you assume to be the case is very often not the case.
Yeah. If you remember, there was one case when our client was the survivor of the widower. The husband passed away, but he made the will gifting all the properties to a charity, and even though after he passed away, and even though he made the will before he got married, because same-sex relationship was not recognized under the Hong Kong law, actually the marriage doesn't revoke that will, and the widower become disinherited. What would be the right in that circumstances?
So that wasn't I do remember that case. That was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it was before Edgar and Henry's case.
Yes.
Now, that's exactly why you need to take advice. Now, you would say that that kind of will may be revoked by the marriage.
But it's not definite, the
It's
answer.
not definite,
Yeah, because it had not been tested
It has not been
in
tested.
court.
Yeah.
Henry's case doesn't cover that
That's
part
right.
of the will's
That's right.
ordinance.
There are still open questions.
Yes.
I can take a view, and I would take a view that it's likely that the court would treat it like that. But that's altogether why planning
Yes.
and having in place a clear will is so important.
Okay, let's say that the circumstances is that the spouse is in any event disinherited. He or she get nothing from the deceased spouse estate. Does she or she have any right to the estate?
Yeah, there is something called the inheritance provision for family and dependents ordinance, and that provides a mechanism for people who have been disinherited, or even if they have been inherited but they haven't been sufficiently inherited, to apply to the court for a discretionary order. This application used to be that it was only for opposite sex married couples or opposite sex couples. But Henry and Edgar's case establishes that it applies equally for same-sex couples.
Yes, and the difference between couples who are not married and married is that for the unmarried couples, there's no de facto marriage in Hong Kong. No matter how long two people have been together, cohabiting together, if they're not married, they're not married.
Yeah, there's this persistent rumor that there's something called common law marriage.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist in Hong Kong.
It doesn't exist in Hong Kong.
Straight or gay, doesn't matter.
And for the unmarried couple, if they want to make a claim against the estate of the deceased partner, they can go into what other categories ruled under the 481. But that part requires that person to show that he or she has always been a financial dependent before they are eligible to make a claim against the estate. And by way of financial dependent, it means that basically they have been receiving financial resources from the deceased, paying for the house, and in order to show that, which effectively means that the supporting affidavit would require them to detail their life that they had together. And that is so intrusive. After one the spouse passed away, you need to basically open up everything to show that he or she has been dependent. And the most embarrassing and humiliating part is that the other party, when there's a dispute, usually will be the other family members of the deceased.
Yeah, and it can get ugly.
It can get very ugly. The cases that we have dealt with, a lot of time, either the family denies that they're in a relationship, or they deny having this financial dependency, or they claim that a lot of time that actually the two of them have already part way. They broke up before the deceased passed away.
There's no more financial dependence because of whatever has happened. Now, you've highlighted two big differences. One of them is it can be the difference between having half and having nothing.
Yes.
Or having half and having merely enough to sustain you.
Yes.
You're not really being treated equally with
Yeah.
other spouses. But the second problem, which you highlighted, is this problem that it invites conflict.
Yes.
It invites expense.
Yes.
Which is why planning ahead of time is so important.
Yes, and in that respect, we're talking about just making a simple will. That can solve a lot of issues. And together with what we've just discussed, like the empowering power of attorney or the Advance Health Directives, can definitely avoid a lot of dispute.
Is the difference between a few $1,000s
Yeah.
and a few $1 million.
Yeah, and avoiding a very gruesome and highly contentious estate dispute, which we have come across a lot. That wraps up our discussion today. This is a very sad subject, but again, it is something that is very important that every couple in a same-sex relationship should think about.